not for want of trying. Welcome to I think it's the sixth of these podcasts, fifth or sixth. First of all, I'm going to say sorry that the sound is still in absolute shambles. It's not for want of trying. I invested in this, try to get it to work. Spent an hour this morning, messaged them on WhatsApp to people and tried to get it troubleshot. Didn't work, so fingers crossed the next one after this is going to work. So on this, today it's myself on the Irish and British podcast, or as Jeffrey would call it, the prodcast. So it's Jeffrey Dudgeon. You should be a lot more well known than you are. Like, obviously in political circles you're well known, but I don't think you're well enough known.
No, I'm a sort of third level politician in some respect. I mean, I'm known as a gay activist and personally got homosexuality decriminalised through Strasbourg. And my problem to some extent is that is all. The BBC in particular only sees me in that context, and they're only interested in, that's the sparkling water over doing it. They only see me in that context, so even though I'm quite heavily involved in other politics, a whole squad of issues, they just bring me up about a gay issue mostly, or something very local, because having been a councillor in South Belfast.
Yeah. What was that, like mid-80s, early 80s you were going over to Strasbourg?
Yeah, well, it concluded in 81, so that's 40 years ago. Oh. The law was changed in 82. Basically, London was going to change the law and then found local opposition. You know, trickery of the NIO. They thought, oh, we can unite Catholic and Protestant against this law reform. So they got Cardinal Fee to announce in my letter that he was against law reform and pays the obviously. And then they said, right, well, we'll do nothing, let Strasbourg do the needful. As cynical as that, because I actually saw a document, an NIO minister saying, you know, scribbling on the side, yes, leave it, let Strasbourg do it.
Yeah, okay. Well, wasn't it Save Ulster from sodomy, was it?
Yeah, that was the run-up to it. That was whenever the government, which is the Labour government at the time, was working up to decriminalising. And they said they would in fact do it, and then Save Ulster from sodomy was Paisley's response, which is very successful in terms of, you know, he got every council, I think, to agree to oppose law reform and had demonstrations and petitions. It was as good as you can get in those terms. He never had a majority of people, because most people here are actually a wee bit more liberal than they like.
Actually, that's funny. I'm just making sure everyone's ticking over here. Well, that makes me think of something. I was reading the Terence O'Neill biography a few months ago, and there's an excerpt in it that I love to point out. There's this idea that when he made his Standing at the Crossroads speech, and that later when, you know, civil rights were enacted, that there was unionism en bloc, en masse, unanimously was against all the reforms. Whereas actually, if you look at the polling from the time, it was a fraction that were against it, but that small fraction was perceived as what representing unionism.
Well, it was also his political realities. He was beholden to 25 MPs or something, and as soon as he lost a significant number of those, he was in jeopardy.
Yeah.
So the way politics worked.
But I just mean, more generally, not getting into the nitty gritty of the political underworld and undergrowth, just out there in wider society, that again, it's just the Pete Sherlow doctrine of actually, certainly Republicans, nationalists like the unionism en masse as one sort of bigoted bloc, whereas actually it's very quilted, and I don't know.
Well, you're right, and I mean, O'Neill the whole civil rights issue came at the end of the 60s, and the 60s, Northern Ireland was blossoming in the sort of, you could say, liberal or modern or progressive or
Yeah.
of the time. Things were, I mean, just think of things like pop music and Van Morrison.
Yeah.
You know, the troubles and the conflict were put to one side in that decade, and you know, the 50s and 40s had not been bad, and things had been gradually improving economically, not least to do with O'Neill's policies of attracting industry.
Yeah.
So, you know, everything would have been great if the issues hadn't foregrounded. I mean, it's always, if you want a political lecture, politics is innately conservative in the sense that it's hard to change from within, because people are already established and got their MPs, for example, are already in place. They appeal, you know, to some extent they have to appeal to the baser instincts.
Yeah.
So to modernise unionism, which I was a member of the Northern Ireland Labour Party as a teenager, and we had all the reforms that became the civil rights reforms. They were our policy.
Yeah. Again, that's the other sort of thing that's been lost in time. The fact that so many young unionists, if I look at the likes of Ray Davey, when he talks about the very early days of the civil rights protests and action and whatnot, there was a slight sense of bewilderment, because I don't think young Protestant unionists were maybe totally au fait with what was going on. And then when they did, they kind of responded positively to it. This is from my reading. But then,
in the university in particular, and in leftist circles, there were some unionists on the original Civil Rights Committee, or one maybe, and Northern Labour Party people like Erskine Holmes was on the committee. It was a popular front of sorts, even though the motor was effectively republicanism, and it was the new way of doing things rather than war. It was a form of lawfare, you could say, almost at the time. It just hit.
Trojan horse, no?
It wasn't that Trojan, you know, it was pretty obvious that the Republicans were significant in amongst it, and people are told to forget about that. It didn't matter, but they were there and they were helping out, you know, old IRA men helping out in the marches and through the country areas and that sort of thing. In the country, people, unions and nationalists knew. Yeah,
so that's where Ray Davies, in case people don't know, is the founder of Carmela, and went to my church and was very nice to me. And when I was a teenager, I didn't appreciate the enormity of the man who was being so nice to me. But he said that it very quickly became evident that the civil rights movement meant a lot more than just civil rights. It meant the United Ireland. So this idea now that you can't almost even say that.
Well, you're right in some respects. It was also happening alongside the change of attitude of the IRA and republicanism. The early days of what became the official Republicans, they were sounds a bit technical. They were into the stages theory of Marxism, reform the society, and then unite the working class. The Communist Party's concept as well. The Communist Party was very dominant in the Civil Rights Association, and they were very Protestant in their background, oddly or not oddly, because during the war, the Communist Party blossomed with these Anglo-Soviet alliance and so on. So you got seriously significant numbers of Protestant members joining the Communist Party.
For example, Joe Stalin was the ally.
My mother reminds me, or used to. In 1942, there was the Aid for Russia campaign run out of, I think it was done by Lord Beaverbrook and the Daily Express. So there were big campaign rallies, fundraising. She went to, she remembers a meeting in Grosvenor Hall addressed by Lady Brookborough, wife of the Prime Minister, and Betty Sinclair, who's the head of the Communist Party of Northern Ireland, you know, joint meeting. So that obviously had an effect in the particularly in the working class areas and the vote. And because the British Labour Party that is didn't stand candidates here, didn't organise here, the Communist Party took up the franchise in many ways that the Labour Party had abandoned.
Yeah, but Catholicism was one of the strongest opponents of communism, wasn't it?
Oh yes, at that moment, I mean, it was traditional Catholicism. Well, you know, you're drawing me back into history, but the 1930s Spanish Civil War, Catholic Church was self-evidently against the Republicans. We were effectively in alliance with the communists because they were brutalising Catholic clergy and nuns and stuff. So, but I mean, the Belfast Progressives were in favour of the Republicans, and the Catholic Church favoured the nationalists.
Yeah.
You know, there were two groups of people went to Spain from Ireland: the nationalists under Owen O'Duffy, supporting the fascists, and other communists, mostly from Belfast, who supported the Republicans. And one of the big names in left politics, Harry Midgley, who was a councillor at the time, he lost his seat because the Catholic Church and the Irish News moved against him in the subsequent election about 1938. He had quite significant Catholic support until then.
Right. So, sorry, we're going from talking about in about 1981, 82 to the Spanish Civil War. So, but I think it was just a comment you made about, although you had to save Ulster from sodomy, you were saying that actually there was a strong reservoir of more liberal, pro. Yeah,
there was, and there still is. I mean, Northern Ireland can be you can run on two levels.
Yeah.
Everyone is effectively modern. We might be 2 years behind London and 6 days behind Bradford or something. But at the same time, there is an ethnic conflict. Under the surface, been here certainly since 1600s. And you don't resolve ethnic conflicts. They never get resolved. They have to simmer. The best you can do with a conflict like that is let it simmer and avoid it boiling over. That boiled over in '69. That was a big problem. It boiled over in 1921, 22 in Belfast. But you can't resolve ethnic conflicts. And on top of that, we've got a border conflict. You know, it's the same conflict really, but a lot of countries just have ethnic internal divisions between minorities and majorities. But here we've got a minority-majority problem or issue, and the neighbouring state is part of one of the groups. It'd be a bit like Alsace-Lorraine in Germany, France, which is very significantly German area. Alsace was until it's basically Francofied now since 1945, but it was the key. There's ethnic disputes. The more you look around, every European country has got huge ethnic disputes if you look closely.
Well, that's the thing that on almost naivety that we think about our own exceptionalism, that so Northern Ireland and Ireland is unique, and that plantation and large movement and displacement of populations is unique to here. Whereas you look to Haiti shares an island with the Dominican Republic. Haitians want to take over the Dominican Republic, and the DR people used to sit in the Dominican Republic restaurant in New York every morning. They hate the Haitians, and so on and so forth.
There's a racial aspect as well. One's white, one's black.
Yeah, we talk about being people in the UK, so
one's French, one's Spanish.
They're all colonists, that's for sure. There's no natives there. But to talk about being, so black, Asian, Middle East, or whatever, and they're all subject to racism by white people, whereas some of those brown people in the Dominican Republic are very racist towards the black people in Haiti. So,
well, if you go, I'm not going to go into race just at the moment. But
I just mean what you're saying about just.
Well, just one point is that Chinese and Indians are notoriously skin color conscious. You know, it's huge. They want to be lighter skinned than they may be, and so it goes. It's a common theme throughout the globe.
But I remember I do Airbnb sometimes up in Bushmills, my grandparents' house, and there's these Italians that stayed with me, and because I'd done Erasmus, I'd met Italians, and generally, you know, the Dutch people speak very good English, the French okay, Spanish not so great, and the Italians' English is just abysmal. but these Italians spoke really good English, and I was like, what's going on? And they're like, oh, we're from, what's that, the Germany type part of it?
Tyrol.
Yeah, Tyrol. So apparently they speak German as well, and just whatever way their education system works, they're very English. So obviously these guys have I don't know the exact politics of it, but they're
It's not unlike this place actually, Tyrol. I don't know if it's resolved yet. I mean, the Germans lost the war, so the Italians got more maybe than they having switched sides. The Italians got or hung on to stuff that they got in 1918.
Yeah.
But there's still issues there. I think there's a minority problem of significance. I'm not going to tell you very much about it, but the one I'm currently reading a lot of stuff about Central Europe, between the wars in Czechoslovakia and all.
Oh.
And the more you poke around, you realise the complexity of all these issues and the confusion of the borders that were set in 1918. Whenever we talk about the Munich Agreement and the betrayal of the Czechs, but at the very moment they were writing the Munich Agreement and Hitler was moving in, the Poles and Hungarians were trying to get bits of territory from Czechoslovakia at the very same time. So nobody's good.
Yeah, it was just sort of the way, this is now controversial to say that you're proud to come from Northern Ireland and that you're proud of the rope works and the linen works and was it the made bottled water here? Was it fizzy water?
Cantrell and Cochrane were big employers here. I don't know if they.
Well, that's how I was brought up there in talking about the industry and great manufacturing. But now the likes of Duncan Morrow would say the Harlan Wolf is but a symbol of Protestant domination and oppression. But I was sort of saying it was ugly and it's bad and regrettable, but this idea that this sort of religious-based suspicion and prejudice, so on and so forth, discrimination, was unique to Belfast. I think it's because we don't share language with France and Germany and farther into Europe, but surely those sort of tensions aren't unique.
No, they're not unique. I think obviously what was particular in Northern Ireland is you had a majority and a minority community, and the majority community, which is also technically the minority community in Ireland, was doubly nervous of its future position after partition. It got control of the 6 counties, political as well as physical, and I think it's true to say that it became majoritarian.
Yeah.
With all the faults that come out of that, and there was both an attitude, and it's partly a Protestant attitude to Catholicism. Dislike of Catholicism became almost like a state position.
Yeah, well, it wasn't. That's the other thing. I'm not being anti-Catholic here, but this idea that it wasn't. That it was just there's a term. It's ultramontane. This idea that it was just some sort of benign faith. It was actually it was a political. It had a very strong political because it claimed dominion.
Well, it's been. I mean, let's go back to Elizabeth Tudor and her basically repression of Catholics in Tudor England. It was because their loyalty was to something greater than the state at that time. The state being England, and they had loyalty both to Spain or Italy or the Vatican, so they were untrustworthy or untrusted, and that was replicated here as well. I do think that one of the big problems between the two communities, and the Protestants probably don't recognise enough, is it's not just resentment, it's an anger that the Catholic community, or many significant people in it, feel what's the correct phrase? They feel that it's not just that they're second-class citizens, that they feel they were treated like rubbish.
Yeah.
That's what you could say, like crudely said. The oppression was very shallow. In fact, to some degree, the shallower the oppression or repression or minority status, whatever, the stronger the hatred and reaction and partition, which is very much both sides of the border behaved almost identically.
Yeah.
I mean, even Mary Lou McDonald says now it was Rome rule.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a bit unwiser, but she did say, they were right to resist home rule. Well, if you take that position, you might as well become a unionist.
Yeah, well, that was kind of, I think she must have made that speech, the masters of industry presently, maybe not really realising that was why.
I've seen it twice now.
Oh, yeah.
She did it in a gay event once.
That's the big thing for me.
You remove that bottle in my way of line of sight.
Would you be averse to me?
No.
You want one? No?
Yeah.
The big thing I'd like to bring up, but in terms of we're getting into deep politics, but it's because the whole basically in the South it was illegal for intermarriage in the sense that you couldn't hold on to your faith if you're Protestant and American Catholic. It wasn't a choice of it was you have to then be.
The Knights Mary decree of about 1905, which is helped the build-up of the resentment against home rule, because that was effectively, the Catholic Church changed the rules somewhat, that you had to make a promise to bring up the children.
Now, could you imagine in Northern Ireland if they had a law that all intermarriages had to be brought up Protestant?
Well, it wasn't a state law, it was a religious law.
But with the dynamic of with the way the South was in the government, it more or less was state, was it not? Because state.
Well, that's the irony. The irony of I make this point very heavily in my books on Roger Casement. Republicans, the separatists, I think is a better way of describing them. They sought to create a Gaelic-speaking republic, and they ended up with an English-speaking Catholic state, and that was always going to happen.
Yeah.
The unions were not unaware of that and knew that the idiots who believed in progress, or they believed that you can bring people together within a republic. Well, that was proven not to be the case. So they created a Catholic state and a very stable Catholic state for economically not prosperous.
No.
Huge emigration.
500,000 a decade.
Yeah.
40s, 50s, 60s.
But basically the Catholic state lasted until 1970.
Yeah.
And then they changed tack. And ultimately now Catholicism has been discarded.
Yeah. So for
speed incredible.
But Northern Ireland cannot be analysed in isolation. That the fact that the nature of what it was.
True, but Northern Ireland's got no friends in the unionists.
Yeah.
No friends in the world intellectual community, let alone political community. So the big problem I also see with Northern Ireland is you're defending the status quo if you're a unionist.
Yeah.
And that's never very national.
Yeah.
You're a conservative, effectively, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Or you have to be at least a bit conservative. And so you'll never get a friend in the world of progressive.
Yeah. Well, that's the term
arrangement
that I was using in the last podcast that BBC journalist wrote, calling Orange men the despised tribe or the despised hangers on, and because they're sort of seen, we're almost seen as the way the Israelis are, settlers almost.
I think Israelis have more friends.
Yeah.
And the worst one obviously was trying to say that we were the white South Africans of the world, apartheid state and all that. That was used quite heavily for a long period. It's not out of fashion now, but
it's not said and it's sort of not made public. But if you chat with people online, they'll quite say, that Unionist Protestants are equivalent to what was the French colony in North Africa.
You know, the French Pied Noir.
What did you call
They were Pied Noir. They were the French.
Libya? No, not
No,
Algeria.
Algeria.
But
And they were maybe 10% of the community, but they were a coastal caste above the Muslims, Arabs,
yeah,
Berbers.
I'm not saying that there wasn't classism in the sense of a caste, but the idea that, you know, France to Algeria is 1,600 miles away, whereas, and that was a physical concerted planting, like a huge displacement.
Very recent, it was 1830 onwards.
Yeah, whereas this is millennia, the movement between these two islands.
First letter I wrote to the papers when I must have been about 15 was saying that Algeria is not an island.
Yeah.
And that, ironically, my first trip abroad in 1962, I went to Marseille to a sailing school, and it was the very summer that the French Algerians came back, 1 million of them, in about 3 months.
Well, that was a dream, I think, for Republicans, was it not? Just at the university.
Up in the park, yeah. They still get that. Shinner Box will tell you that very rapidly.
Yeah.
Why don't you bugger off?
Yeah, well, Robin Swan was told
Was he?
at the start of the lockdown, he was told to get RNG, get back to.
Yeah, I mean the rage of the media, the social media, which I don't really do.
You don't use Twitter, sure you don't?
No, hardly. I think you'd be depressed if you read it all. You must get a fair amount.
I do, but I get tangled in and then I try to ignore it. But yeah. Well, tell me more about you said what your father's from Tyrone, your mother was from Belfast. Tell us a little bit about that.
My mother's English, actually from Newcastle on Tyne.
Yeah.
And I think that makes me slightly mid-Irish Sea.
Yeah.
And my dad was from County Tyrone.
And how did they meet?
They met in my father's brother was a doctor in the south of England, and he was visiting and met her at a
Dance or something.
Actually, met her on a bus, he said.
And
she came here, so she was here 50 or 60 years. As an English woman, she always felt a little bit that sort of unionist attitude to the English, slightly suspicious.
What did you say there? The unionists?
Unionist attitude. Well, nationalists quite like English people and hate British people, or hate the British like the English, and almost vice versa amongst unions. There was a bit of that sort of slightly, almost snooty view that the English don't understand that, and that they're English as opposed to Ulster.
Yeah, I said that in actually the first one, that the weird dynamic. Republicans like to laugh at how loyalists aren't British, like the ones that aren't British, but they've got no self-awareness to realise that the Republicans down south are laughing at them for their over-the-top displays of Irishness.
That's the minority thing, yeah.
And then the other thing is that, as just what you were saying, that actually a lot of Irish get on better with English than the Unionists do, and some of the Unionists, I would say, get on better than the Southerners and the Northern Nationalists would get on.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the Irish migrated to England in literally millions.
Yeah.
Over a century or more.
It was 500,000 in the 40s, 50s, 60s.
And they basically integrated into. They didn't become an ethnic minority in England.
Yeah.
For various reasons, it wouldn't have suited. I mean, it became an ethnic minority in America of sorts, but not in England.
Yeah.
Well, of late, and it's very clear. And you notice how significant the number of Irish people in British, noticeable people in British life are obviously Irish background. They're not coming out, I mean, they're not Irish nationalists living in England, but they are obviously Irish.
Well, there's that lady that got in trouble there for, heaven forbid, doing a podcast with a British soldier and was.
So I didn't quite understand that. Who was she?
Out there an Irish lady talked to in the middle of the roadway to a British soldier.
And where she lived is this person.
Well, as most of the, that's what I was sort of saying in her defence, that whether it be, the fellow from Cork, from Bandon, or Terry Wogan, there's the Irish just come over to London and get jobs in the media, and that's been going on for decades now.
Considerable number of, I noticed on the TV and during the COVID stuff, a lot of the doctors are Irish.
Yeah, and well, Laura Whitmore is it or something? Her name is. So it's just not really fair. But yeah, the Anglophobia is still alive and well. But so yeah, and
I'm getting worse in Ireland.
Uh-huh.
Partly Brexit, partly.
I think it's a convenient. Well, yeah, okay. The media's hyped it up a bit, but I think it's a convenient excuse to ask because of Brexit. I think it's just a latent.
Well, there's also there's a triumphalism in the air, which
Yeah.
partly because the Irish have got significant power in the EU and status and traction, and I think that and there's majoritarianism amongst nationalists now in the north that they're in charge. They feel even if they're not in power, they're in charge, and they can. The direction of travel is their doing or their choice.
Yeah. Well, with regard to your identity growing up, you know, what you grew up in Finicky Way, was it?
No, East Belfast.
East Belfast, and you've one of many brothers and sisters.
One sister.
Sister. What school did you go to?
Secondary school, Campbell College,
That's right. Yeah.
which is just up the road from Dayboy. No.
All right. Okay. Any famous contemporaries?
Perhaps Michael Gibson. I think.
Oh, the rugby player.
Yeah.
Oh, he's a hero of mine.
He was a bit older than me. I didn't like the school because I was sort of a bit of a rebel and it was very conventional.
Yeah.
Wasn't particularly. Well, the teaching wasn't the best, I don't think. Another contemporary is Paul Bew, Lord Bew now.
Oh, yeah.
He remembers me more than I remember him. You know, he was a year or two younger.
He's the guy that came up with Garden Centre Protestant.
Yes. His big line is they ought to erect a statue at City Hall to the unknown British taxpayer.
So true, right? So true. And what was that? Was your childhood? Was it monoculture, or did you have friends of all sorts?
It was British actually. Looking back, I was in a little. It wasn't an Ulster upbringing. It was a British upbringing. Even reading British newspapers.
Yeah.
Travelling to and from England. Hardly local politics hardly intruded. It was a monocultural area as well.
What year were you when you were in Campbell?
60 to 65.
Oh wow, that's so interesting.
Before you were born, I suspect, Brian.
Yeah.
Or Brian, should I call it?
And
Brian.
So you're at Campbell, but would you have had much cross community interaction?
None. No, when there were a few Catholics in the neighbourhood, but didn't seem to interact with them.
What was there like cultural difference?
Well, I didn't know.
And what? So when your identity, was it just British or was it?
Just British. Just like, I mean, I'm talking with him before I was 10 or 12 years old. That's sort of before I was on really comprehending things. Yeah, it was just British. It was, you know, one knew. Looking back, they knew there was a problem somewhere, but I never really coalesced into it or became strong in your mind.
Yeah, but presently you would consider yourself Irish as well as British, no?
I don't know how I consider myself anything in those respects. Unionist and would be a better description.
So you're not Irish?
It's a meaningless concept. I mean, I'm Irish, I live on the island, I interact with matters Irish quite a lot. But it's none of those descriptions are unloaded.
Yeah. Okay. Would you say it's just having lived through the troubles that it's just too heavy a term for you?
Well, all of them are freighted with baggage or luggage, as I say. You know, everyone has about 600 identities, in different levels, different significance to them. Being gay is a strong identity, maybe less so now, but it used to be almost most important identity, particularly when one was campaigning to get the law changed and so on. Just living in the area I live in Belfast is a big identity for me. So you local, you build identities on top of each other, and they move in time. One goes up, another goes down. I mean, whether you're Irish, British, or Ulster is a pointless discussion.
Well, would you follow any sports like Ulster or Ireland rugby? Or
None at all.
No, just no interest.
I'd rather watch paint dry.
Really?
That wasn't very fashionable in Campbell College, I'll tell you. Position. Just never interested me.
But do we consider yourself British?
In the broad sense, yeah.
European?
British as in, I'm not English, not Scottish.
Yeah. And what about European?
Again, it's the same problem. I mean, a minor interest in other countries, but travel to some of them. Christian maybe would be more significant. And so far as European does mean Christian, I think, in many ways, because there's no language similarity. There's been huge conflicts between all the European countries over the centuries. European continent is back to the German concept, really, to get around the problem of being German.
Yeah, I don't want to get into Brexit and all that really at all, but I think that's it's just I think certainly when we're talking about Ireland and this new wave of Anglophobia, there's the Germans.
You're more like that.
Someone left in my lighter, and this one won't work. I could. I'm in the back of my head. I'm trying to think, where is there another lighter? Boris is a rogue. He's a liar. He's done this. He's done that. He's a philanderer. What about Michel Barnier? Could you even tell me where he's from, where he's represented? This idea that the Germans and the
French, obviously.
I know, but it's part of that German-French duopoly. But this idea that they're without reproach, they've got no issues, no baggage, it's a little bizarre, isn't it?
Well, I mean, part of the government of Germany's wealthy and there's 80 million of them. We hardly know. I only know 2 Germans, I think, I can speak of. Germany tries not to have a past, and so it's a perfect state in many respects because it's not aggressive or aggrandizing.
But is it? Well, obviously the migrant stuff is just truly extraordinary. How Merkel stood there and let them just said, right, we're Germany, we're going to do it. But in terms of the austerity and their direction of just the neoliberal order in Europe, is it not quite aggressive how they dictate?
Well, they can't not dictate to some degree because they have the money. And they do have sort of residual interests, they're friendly with Croatia and that. Certain countries they're on better terms with them, they would advance their interests. They have an issue with Russia, which is complex. And then they have to be careful with Poland. Obviously, they can't be too rough on Poland.
In what sense?
Well, because of the memories of the huge. Poland was a country that suffered more casualties than any other in the Second World War, 3 or 4 million or 5 million. So that one it can always break out again. All those resentments with these other Central European countries.
Yeah. There's nothing present here.
I'm reading a lot of German novels, literature at the moment. A guy called Walter Kempowski. He's written particularly about 1945 and the expulsions of the Germans from all those Central European, something like 4 million Germans left those countries in a matter of 10 months.
Those were the days after the Allied victory.
As the Russian troops, partly as the Russian troops came forward, they fled and they died in their droves, you know, just from war or attrition. And then on top of that, there was coherent expulsion policies of Czechoslovakia, booted out, I can't remember, 500,000 Germans, almost within a week or two. So colossal amount of interchange, and one day the Germans may begin to remember that and think, we didn't get a very good deal out of the Second World War finale, and maybe we should try and retrieve some of those territories. I'm surprised they haven't. That's true.
Right. Okay.
It's not fascism, Nazism.
Yeah.
It's just German nationalism.
Yeah. Okay. So I wasn't sure how you regarded yourself in terms of identity. I always say I'm just extremely Irish, but having grown up in the mid to late 90s, it's just a completely different complexion. I can certainly sympathise with those people who lived through the 70s and 80s and can see what the baggage that term has. With regards to unionism presently, it has a PR problem and it has an image problem. You've already mentioned that it's got no friends. Can that be addressed?
Probably not. I don't think it's worth trying in some respects, because if you have to try, you're not going to do it very well. I had a correspondence with Alex Kane in the newsletter a month back, and he basically asked what my policy was for unions, and I said, hang on in there.
Yeah.
And I think that's about it, really. I'll enjoy hanging on in there in some respects, because effectively, even though Protestants or unions aren't a minority, they're on the cusp. And nationalists either want rid of you or want you, and you can play both angles or have to play both angles. I mean, confuse this, but there's a distinct difference between Southern Ireland and Catholics or nationalists in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And you've got to remember, the majority of Catholics now vote for Sinn Féin, so the two are not quite unsynonymous. The South now, until recently, until COVID anyway, was an attractive country with a moderate outlook and prosperous. Not aggressive, particularly to the north.
Or anti-British. Are you talking about pre-Brexit?
Yeah.
But
pre-COVID, pre-Brexit.
Quite aggressive, maybe Bradker and Coveney.
Well, Bradker and Coveney have become exceptionally aggressive, and so is the sort of illiberal media. It's an interesting phenomenon. Reasons are many, but until that came about, it was a nice enough place, and you could say, oh, we could have, if not United Ireland, we can have a good time together.
Yeah.
And but the nationalists seem to think, oh, you can join, and we'll allow you Stormont if you join United Ireland. Well, that's the worst in the world concept. You end up having the internal conflict in the north, but you're stuck in a country you didn't ask to be stuck in. Overall, so my point is that there are two conflicts in Ireland. There's a sort of vague national conflict between England, Ireland and Britain, and then there's the internal ethnic conflict in the north, which is particularly nasty and can get very violent, and it won't go away with United Ireland unless the Protestants depart.
Yeah. Can you see United Ireland on the horizon?
Well, not really.
So on one hand, you're very pessimistic and downbeat on where unionism is and they can't do anything but hang on. And then the other party is saying, well, we'll be hanging on for
Well, hanging on is what you do, and it can irritate a lot of people even doing that, so you're winning.
Yeah.
But you have to do that. So, forgotten what you were saying.
I'm sorry, can you see United Ireland, you're being very pessimistic about unionism, but then you're saying you just have to hang on.
Well, the older you get, the longer your understanding of events and all. Unionists, Protestants, whatever, aren't going to go away. Will never go away. They're historically here since whenever. The English have been here, strictly speaking, since 1200 or something on the island. But they were the Normans.
They were the French.
They were French. I mean, I think it's very interesting little fact. Whenever the Normans arrived and one of them became the Archbishop of Dublin, he replaced the first Irish Archbishop of Dublin for 1,000 years, Lawrence O'Toole, who had previously replaced a Viking Archbishop of Dublin. So you had the three groups within a lifespan of switches of control.
Yeah.
Which is quite amusing in a way. I mean, the Vikings were alright. The Vikings disappeared, but they left a mark. All those names like Strangford and Carlingford.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And they're genetically probably still feel the Vikings. You look a bit like them. So.
Yeah, I used to say that in my Erasmus program is sort of Viking. So, what about my big thing is, though I'm young, so I didn't really live with Hume as a politician, because the media's told me that the Good Friday Agreement's good, Hume's good, it's good, and then I talk to unionists assuming these things, and like, no, I don't like Hume. So my whole spiel is that like Hume said that there's two traditions, one island, and I'm just repeating what I've asked other people. My whole thing is always, that the high-minded and academic are sort of saying, yeah, it's one island, so we need two people, so we need to unite two people through understanding and reconciliation conversations. But apart from sort of Varadkar making the odd statement or Micheál Martin, it doesn't actually percolate down in the ground in terms of Irish people understanding or wanting to understand unionists, who they are, what they are.
This explains books on the Protestants sell very well in the south of Ireland. Yeah. People like Susan McKay put into umpteen editions.
Yeah.
And then her book was called Ulster Protestants, An Unsettled People, or very good title. The book was crap, but anyway, the reason they buy them is to try to understand the Unionists and Protestants, but they can't. Essentially, nationalists can never understand Unionists because they can't comprehend how somebody would not be a United Ireland nationalist. It's just beyond their imagination.
Yeah.
So basically, Unionists are either nasty intruders or bluffers or us, but they don't know it. And those books will continue to sell because they'll never answer the question because it's unanswerable.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. But it all goes back partly, and this is, I spent after the sort of Gaylord Reform era, I spent years in school to some extent in the margins of politics here on basically trying to get the Labour Party organised, and it was all to do with a group which you won't have heard of. But our position was effectively, it was a leftist position. There are two nations in Ireland, and therefore you can't. And this was contrary to sort of Catholic nationalism of the era, it still is obviously. So, you try to solve a national conflict, that's fine. But you cannot solve it by unity, that's by definition. Yeah. And to say there are two nations in Ireland is heresy, because it's saying that Irish national position is Ireland is a single nation defined effectively by God or seawater or something, and there's no other country in the world. All states' borders are artificial. All states are artificial. There was Charlie Mackey's big complaint about it was an artificial 6-county state. There isn't a country in the world whose borders and frontiers are not made by humans.
And made on largely ethnic,
cultural grounds or power or wealth.
Yeah.
And that's just fact.
Yeah. The big query I always have is like, so a small island cannot be divided. GB, our next door neighbours, are not that much big. We're not that much smaller, but so why is it okay to have a partition with Scotland and to have all the trade barriers that they would have?
Scotland and England weren't one country until James I united the monarchy in 1705 or something. They united the countries. You just mentioned Haiti and Dominican Republic, Portugal, Spain. Yeah, so islands don't have to be nations, and certainly not single states. And then there's no, every year, I don't think there's a European frontier that is longer living than the 26-county border, because almost every country has changed their frontiers in the last century. In Europe.
Yeah. The other big thing that I find truly fascinating, you're talking about simplistic, very, very simplistic Republican talking points about like artificial, gerrymandered, and so on and so forth, sectarian head count, this, that, and the other. If you just look at Cyprus, this is fascinating. Is this very naive view that like if Britain had just got out of Ireland, all would have been fine? Well, Britain got out of Cyprus, and what happened? Turkey came in and brutalised the Cypriots and the natives to a degree that made Britain like truly benevolent.
Well, that's always the way. Empires have one virtue in that they can cope with conflicting nationalities within their area, and they basically squash both of them if need be. The Ottomans were notorious. They kept dozens of nationalities within the Ottoman Empire, and they were really nasty if they wanted to be, if there's any trouble.
Yeah,
but they let them get on with it otherwise.
That's another fascinating sort of like double speak. People always love to talk, not making light of the famine, but always reference like, oh, Turkey stood up and did its part and gave aid to the Irish, but they totally ignore what the Turks then did on many occasions.
Genocide of the Armenians in 1915. They drove the Greeks out of Western Turkey, and the Greeks' own foolishness.
So, I sort of say that in the context
caused it.
The what?
Sorry, go on.
But what I'm saying, we're getting into like niche stuff, but I read, I got into the defence barrister, I think John Kerwin or someone, for like James Philpott Kern or something like that. He defended, I think, the United Irishmen for some of our Hun, and he said something to the terms like, "Are you that naive? You think that you will go into league with the French, and the French generals will come here and bring their men and help you throw away the English, and you don't think they'll take parcels of land and divvy it up among them to reward their generals for the work they've done?" So I'm just sort of saying that in the context of just sort of simplistic thinking that Brits out and all is fine in the world.
Well, nobody ever wins a political battle because everything turns out differently, and the consequences are unforeseen, and you just don't know what's going to happen. But it doesn't stop people battling. So, all the separatists in 1916, many of them were very disappointed with the state they created. Particularly the women, who were quite important in the separatist movement. They were cast to one side overnight. But that doesn't stop. No, you can't win. Doesn't stop you fighting.
Yeah. Which is your analysis for unionism?
You just plow on, enjoy it as best you can.
Yeah.
If you get up the noses of cinder blocks, so much the better. We're into this period of I call it lawfare really, rather than warfare.
Yeah.
Well, warfare was over. We're in what they call the peace process, a ghastly term, which is effectively means you're being processed toward the oven, of Irish unity.
So for our, if we're down south, any Republicans or nationalists watching this, they're probably thinking, what you're talking in these apocalyptic terms of an oven, and what's wrong with United Ireland? What's the fear?
Well, what's wrong with the United Kingdom, United States? It's not what all states are built around ethnic identities, and as far as they can be. So effectively, you're asking peas and beans to live together, and somehow they don't, by and large, but they can, and they can intermarry. But you can't, as I said, you can't resolve ethnic disputes. You can eliminate one of the sides. The only way you can resolve ethnic disputes without murdering one other group is through intermarriage. But even then, you're trapped with what comes out the other side. If you create a third way or something, so there is, if you think small issues, but people do come together if they can agree to differ. That's the key. Can you agree to differ and put up with things as they are?
So, but you just couldn't put up with a Dublin government, like Dublin executive, governing events and affairs and finance in Belfast?
It's not that I couldn't put up with it. I wouldn't warm to it. It's not what I want. And it also means breaking up the political entity I have empathy with.
Yeah.
But as I said, I just ask Slovenian, do they want to be in Croatia? Or, well, probably not. So why should you keep forcing them, keeping at them, nagging them, shouting at them, squealing, come behind their back? And then they say, well, partly to assist the Catholic minority who are trapped in the opposite position, and that's true. So, but it's never. There has been a period up till Brexit, probably that era, when things were motoring along quite well. As I've understood, they agreed the so-called Good Friday Agreement. John Hume's politics becoming constitutional in a sense. You asked me a job, but John Hume never finished that one.
No, I was just sort of saying that I take it as a given that John Hume was a good man in personally and politically, whereas quite a few unionists are sort of like, oh, I've jumped back a wee bit.
Well, he has divine status in the South, so he can't. Best not to get too involved. He was a very dogged politician. He stuck to one line. He marshalled all the forces very well, effectively, to get where he wanted. You could argue, did he take advantage of the Republican campaign, or was it just inevitable that Republicans they were the problem in the sense of their war, and any politician had to try and take account of it in some way or other. I think almost so said his failing was not to negotiate earlier with the IRA, or not to force himself into that setup. It was never going to make him popular in certain parts, but the SLP had a symbiotic relationship with the IRA. It was just fact. They couldn't build it like it or not. The IRA was building up huge amounts of political credit by most incredible and intrepid warfare, lasting so long, longer than anyone else in Europe. So there was bound to come a time when they were going to cash in, and they did eventually, slowly. And Hume facilitated that, and the unionists trembled particularly. Trimble always, the one time I really met Trimble in those days, he impressed me because he was so adamant that the IRA are going to lay down their arms.
Yeah.
He thought that was absolutely definite. And they were wise to in that respect because they had so much political credit that they could use for the next 30, 40 years. Both the fear of the threat of coming back to the arms and of, because they had softened up the opposition so incredibly well.
You were a councillor for how many years?
Five long years.
Is that all?
Yeah.
You did a couple of times?
No, I didn't. I came very late to elected office. Enjoyed it tremendously. A lot.
What was your career? What was your career?
Mixture. Did about 20 years in various industrial jobs in the shipping industry.
Yeah.
And roughly 20 years in civil service. Actually worked in the latter days in the public health section.
Okay.
I know all about communicable diseases and surveillance and how to deal with outbreaks. I was an administrator who were writing the rules and organising things. A rabies policy and a Q fever policy and a MRSA policy and screening things and dealing with outbreaks like Legionnaire's disease. So I know it all in a minuscule. As far as I can remember.
I suppose I think it's because we've only really known each other for 5-6 years, so that whole time you were a councillor, I never really looked into your background or chatted to you. So that's where that mistakes come from.
Yeah, well, I was a bit, I mean, I can cope with being defeated. It didn't hurt me personally very much, but it was just that needlessness of it. And I was taken out by the DUP. Most of our party were decimated by the Greens or the Alliance Party.
So that's what I was wanting to ask you. I would have seen you out and about quite a lot and sitting removing party posters of a party that I'll not name that were left up months and months after the election. I saw you cutting them down, as you should do. But if you're out and about doing knocking the doors, what is your sense of the people? Are they very divided?
Well, it's peculiar. I mean, the area I represented, there was 5 councillors, 1 from each party. So, at best, I had 20%, and I was the 5th one in, so and it's demographically changing, high immigrant populations, very rapid change in that respect. Significant Catholic population wasn't there previously.
That's around the King's Hall area you were? No?
Well, anywhere from roughly Cranmore Avenue outwards, up to the motorway, over to Beaver.
Yeah.
That is called Balmoral.
Yeah.
And so my significant vote was Beaver and Tuckmona, the two sort of.
So did you keep it to there, or would you have gone out and about the King's Hall and the Leafy suburbs?
You go out everywhere. You don't go out all the bloody time, and you have to do some work in the council.
But your sense of chatting with people, was it there wasn't any hostility, was there, or was there any particular affection or interest, or was it just?
Well, there wasn't enough affection, obviously, because I was taken out by the DUP. By a DUP modernist who wasn't sort of said was from sodomy type. I mean, I got some votes for the being a gay activist from all sorts of strange, unlikely people. Whenever I was eliminated, my vote sprayed in all sorts of directions.
Oh yeah. Where did it go?
Well, some went to Sinn Féin, actually.
Yeah.
And SDLP and Green, all of them.
It's fascinating.
But it just wasn't enough.
That was a year ago now?
A year ago now. I mean, the previous election we had a very good election. Ulster Unionist Party, some nasty commentator called it a dead cat bounce, because we got 7 or 8 seats in Belfast, and but it's the electoral chance to some degree. There was a PUP candidate stood from Tuckmona 5 years ago, and when he was eliminated, I ended up getting many of his votes.
Yeah.
And this time it wasn't. And he brought out, I think, people that were previous voters.
Right. Yeah.
The DUP put in a very local candidate in Beaver and a very sort of middle class candidate for the other part of the constituency.
You're talking about this, the latest one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who resigned after 6 months.
Yeah.
Having promised the earth.
Yeah.
Which rather pissed me off.
And but looking forward, when I see you on Facebook and so on, you're doing a lot of reading, writing, you're writing books, and you're giving speeches.
Well, not much these days, obviously COVID.
You're giving one next week.
I'm doing one next week on Roger Casey because I've written his books on him. But then most of my work is currently on legacy stuff.
Yeah.
Trying to, lawfare is the key operation, key point of conflict.
How do the two sides line up in terms of generals and battalions? Like, are the Greens are powering the orange side, or what way is it looking?
Well, lawfare is entirely used to be, or was, it's essentially a Republican operation. It's the war by other means. The unions are on the back foot, and the DUP is hopeless. Because the DUP are desperate for devolution, they concede all sorts of things that they shouldn't have. And you have to try and retrieve the territory. They agreed the Stormhouse Agreement, which was just creating a mishmash of bodies which were going to investigate every death.
Yeah.
Since the beginning of the Troubles, 3,000 or 4,000. It's going to cost something like £1 billion. Who was to pay? London, hopefully, but they haven't arranged any. But so that's a huge area, and it involves Strasbourg a lot, and there's a lot of legal stuff. So
you're not on the front lines; you're more discussing issues.
Well, I'd say we are on the front line, but we're subterranean. It's all a bit complicated, some of these legal issues. There's a huge number of, Queen's University Legal Department, Ulster University Legal Department, others are effectively gone over to that law area very much, and they predominate in it, and there's only one view is permitted. To some extent, the BBC only sees one view and only argues one, listens to one view, and so we have to fight from behind very much. But I managed to get, I could say I'm marshalling some of that work. I'm not aware. But in particular in Strasbourg, we've now actually intervened in Strasbourg, the first non-nationalist Malone House group. We're trying to fight back at that territory which has been taken over almost entirely by one view. Went to it now, but the Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the one that guarantees the right to life, but has been now so interpreted and maybe over-interpreted that it also requires investigation into every killing. And should you have a £100 million investigation into every killing, or a £10 million, or what's the point of all these investigations anyway? Nobody's going to get prosecuted at the end of it. The context of the times aren't taken into account. You couldn't do an investigation. A soldier was shot in Sebastopol Street in 1973. They were lucky to get the body back without even hunting for the bullets to find out which gun had been used, and even if they had found the bullets, we didn't work here. So there's no chance of reopening those cases again. The state cases are different. 10% where the state killed an individual because the state kept records.
Yeah.
Nobody else did. So it's all that, and they keep saying it's about truth, it's about justice,
Yeah.
it's about reconciliation. And there's only one certainty: there'll be no truth, because only one side will have the truth and will produce it. There's no justice because nobody will be prosecuted. One person a decade. it certainly doesn't bring reconciliation. It drives the old part.
Yeah, I hear you.
Am I not saying anything much?
No. I momentarily forgot what I was going to ask you, or make a point. It is a weird. No, it's great to hear all that. Great to hear your points of view, because again, there is kind of one-way traffic with regards to that narrative or that world. It is interesting though you're saying about there's no records because the provisional IRA didn't have any. The state obviously does, but the provisional IRA, the prefix to the IRA provisional comes from 1916, the Provisional Government of Ireland. So it's funny that they held themselves out to be the legitimate government of Ireland, but so they took all the positive aspects of that, maybe like.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that. Well, maybe I haven't thought about it, but
is it not the provisional?
Well, the IRA split in 1970, and they broke into what became known as the officials and the provisionals. Yeah. But I think they were provisional because they were getting themselves together in 1970 as a separate replacement.
Well, if you read the IRA's Green Book, they say they're the legitimate government of Ireland.
Oh yes, well they've seen there's a continuity, and there is to some degree that they are effectively that Jerry Adams was the president of Ireland in effect, because there's a line of continuity from the 1916. Well, Oglach na Heron. Yeah. So the Irish Republican Army in Irish was the Irish Volunteers. Yeah. Before the IRA, started in 1914.
So you declare yourself the legitimate government of Ireland, but don't take on any of the responsibilities of statecraft, of keeping records and so on and so forth.
Well, that's the point. I mean, governments in exile have certain difficulties, but they've been in exile, but within the state, in a sense.
Yeah. I think this podcast is about just talking about identity and general culture. We've spoken about your upbringing and how you identify. Is there anything else, any other topics or issues that you'd like to go over?
No, because I got into legacy there, which I wanted to at the end. It's been useful.
I thought you were going to tell me you're Irish, but we don't get into that. Anytime we've been talking, it's about art or the general minutiae of local politics. We're not talking about more big picture.
Well, I did. I mean, I just took that notion: are you Irish? Are you British? It's a false sort of dichotomy, because there's so many things.
Yeah. No, I hear you on that, and it's certainly very fashionable right now. With 1,000 genders or something, and LGBTQ plus whatever, many multitude. So that's very, you're very in line with that.
Yes, indeed. You're extremely modish.
But I think that people will be interested, hearing from you, because it's discordant that the caricature image of the unionist is at the very hard line in loyal orders and so on and so forth. You're not in the Orange Order. You're gay, and you're pretty liberal.
Well, there's always been a gay streak in unionism.
Yeah. You did a book on that?
Well, I did a book on Montgomery Hyde, who was the unionist MP in the 50s for North Belfast. He wasn't gay, I don't think, but majored on homosexual law reform, and Oscar Wilde and Roger Casement. He was very into sex and spying. He's an author of 60 books.
Hyde?
Hyde, Harvard Montgomery Hyde.
He wrote the books and did all that stuff?
He did, hundreds of books.
So what did he do?
He was the most prominent MP in Westminster in the 50s, trying to get the law changed.
And where was he from?
North Belfast.
Yeah, again, just sort of cutting and disagreeing. Because this is what I enjoyed talking to you about this earlier. Alex Mansky said Northern Ireland was an irredeemable cesspit, sectarian shithole, or what do you say? Whereas, what you were saying, and I've looked at this further, Mary Jones, the well-known playwright, she would talk about great cross-community interaction, going to dances, hanging out in evenings. As soon as the violence came, it just completely changed. So again, just sort of saying that there's a worldview, our perception that people were trying to push it in Northern Ireland was just beyond appeal. It's like literally Catholics attacked it at every street corner, whereas and Unionists were just these furors. Whereas actually it's a lot more.
Obviously, it's not. I mean, I think what Alex Maskey thinks has been propaganda. No, we weren't that. We had an ethnic dispute to cope with, which people in sort of Birmingham didn't have.
Yeah.
In that respect, we're different, but we're not. We weren't really that much different. We got on with life, and it was, the thing about the 60s as it was, I've said this already, it was quite prosperous, hopeful, modern, and then the troubles came, and once the killing starts, people are driven back into their tribes, and that's just a fact.
Yeah.
And I mean, the bit about, you can say about marriage and intermarriage, until the 60s, there was no intermarriage, next to no intermarriage within Northern Ireland, except in working class communities, because they met in the factories, and the middle classes met nowhere, and didn't intermarry, and they were more fussy maybe about the religion. It's completely reversed in 50 years now, because there's no factories for working class people to meet in, so there's much less of that, and they're more antagonistic, and there's most housing, or many housing areas are heavily segregated, whereas the middle class now meet in the professions and the public sector, the bars and the nightlife, and it's changed, and to some extent middle class Protestants now are deracinated. Partly they've been told they're a bit ghastly, so just keep your trap shut and don't be proud of yourself. And that's, they've come to believe that.
You're right to say that last bit.
And working class Protestants are a tribe apart almost. Nobody interacts with them. They've got no political representation to speak of. They've got no. I mean, the UDA have become criminalised, and they've gone as a political force.
So I suppose we could wrap up actually by looking forward and literally just looking forward to the years ahead. How are you looking at the Northern Ireland Centenary and how that's stacking up and what that represents?
I don't think it's very important. It's a bit of a waste of space, really, because
you really are. What's the word you term when you say you're Campbell? You're controversialist, or what's the term?
Maybe.
Cut against the grain.
Well,
you're a unionist. You're supposed to go yes.
I don't think the creation of Northern Ireland was a particularly happy event. It involved partition. It involved breaking up the United Kingdom. It involved a lot of warfare and death. So it's something that I would celebrate.
Did you what about 1916? Did you?
I didn't celebrate that. I can understand a lot of it, but I didn't celebrate it. And the creation of Northern Ireland. I mean, two things happened in 1921. Northern Ireland was created, and we were given strong against the wishes of. Against the views of the unionist leadership at that moment, or some of them, and Storm has been our problem ever since. I mean, it was quite conceivable, and it was talked about that the 26 counties would depart, and nothing else would happen. That NI would become just be like Birmingham. An integral part of the United Kingdom operating the same way as Scotland and Wales. And that didn't happen because they created Storm. To get Ireland out of the English hair. Because the Tories were high Tories in 10 to 18 were not willing to go to war and break Parliament up over a home rule.
Yeah.
And as soon as they agreed that the Traces County should leave, they decided, let's get Ireland out of our hair entirely and give them a wee Parliament in Belfast.
Yeah.
That'll shut them up. We can forget about them. And it worked in those terms for about 50 years, and then it hasn't worked the next few. At which point I'm going to call it a day.
Right, thanks very much for chatting, Jeffrey.
Okay.
Always good. I'm turning this off now.
Oh.